Imagine you are sitting inside a metal cockpit, 22,000 feet above the European countryside. The air outside is minus 40 degrees Celsius. Below you, enemy territory stretches in every direction. And then it happens. A shudder runs through the airframe, a sound like tearing metal. And when you look to your right, you see it: fire, not smoke, not a warning light, fire. Living, growing, hungry fire, consuming the engine that keeps you alive. You have two choices. You pull the canopy release and bail out, surrendering yourself to whatever fate waits below. Or you hold on, you keep flying. You point that burning machine toward home and you refuse, absolutely refuse, to let it beat you. This is not a story from a Hollywood film. This happened on the afternoon of March 15, 1944. Over the skies of occupied France, a young American pilot in a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt found himself in exactly that position. What he did next would test every boundary of human endurance, mechanical engineering, and sheer, stubborn will. This is the story of the time a P-47 flew 200 miles on a single flaming engine. To understand what happened on that March afternoon, we first need to understand the world that produced it. By early 1944, the Allied air campaign over occupied Europe had entered one of its most brutal and consequential phases. The United States Army Air Forces, operating out of bases across southern England, were conducting systematic strategic bombing operations deep into German-held territory. The objective was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute: destroy the Luftwaffe, dismantle German industrial capacity, and lay the groundwork for the invasion of mainland Europe that was already in preparation. The campaign, known as Operation Argument, and later remembered simply as Big Week, had unfolded just weeks earlier, in February 1944. It had cost the 8th Air Force dearly. Hundreds of bombers lost, thousands of airmen killed, captured, or missing. The mathematics of those missions were brutal and everyone in every squadron understood them intimately. Into this world stepped the 56th Fighter Group, based at RAF Halesworth in Suffolk, England. The 56th was already building a reputation as one of the most effective and aggressive fighter groups in the entire 8th Air Force. Their aircraft was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine so large, so heavy, and so seemingly ungainly that pilots who first laid eyes on it sometimes laughed. It weighed nearly 7 tons fully loaded. It was nicknamed the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and the name fit. Nothing about it looked fast, nothing about it looked elegant. But the P-47 was something extraordinary beneath that brutish exterior. Its Pratt & Whitney R280 double Wasp radial engine produced 2,300 horsepower at full output. It could dive faster than almost anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. And critically, it could absorb punishment that would have destroyed more refined, more delicate aircraft outright. Pilots who had flown it through heavy flak and come home with half a wing, or a shredded tail section, or a barely functioning engine spoke of the P-47 with something approaching reverence. It was the kind of aircraft that seemed to refuse to die even when it had every reason to. The pilot at the center of this story was Second Lieutenant Harold Brown, a 22-year-old from rural Indiana who had earned his wings at Luke Field in Arizona just 8 months earlier. Brown was not yet a celebrated ace. He had 3 confirmed aerial victories to his credit, respectable, but not legendary. He was, by every available description, a precise and disciplined pilot, not given to recklessness, trusted by his flight leader and regarded by his squadron mates as someone who kept his head when things deteriorated. On the morning of March 15, 1944, he had no reason to believe that this particular day would be anything more than another dangerous mission in a long sequence of dangerous missions. He was wrong. The mission briefing at RAF Halesworth that morning was tense in the way all mission briefings were tense: men standing in a cold room, studying maps they already knew too well, listening to intelligence officers describe threats that were becoming increasingly familiar and no less terrifying for their familiarity. The primary objective was escort duty. A formation of B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 381st Bombardment Group, based at RAF Ridgewell, was tasked with striking manufacturing targets in the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France. The escort assignment fell to elements of the 56th Fighter Group, including the 61st Fighter Squadron, Brown's unit. The route would take them out over the English Channel, across the French coastline north of Boulogne, and then southeast into the target area. Total estimated mission duration from takeoff to landing, approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. Distance to the target and back, roughly 280 miles round trip. The weather briefing added its own layer of uncertainty. High overcast was expected. Over the channel, at altitude, winds from the northeast at 35 knots. Temperature at operational altitude, minus 38 degrees Celsius. These were not unusual conditions for the European theater in early spring. They were, however, conditions that made everything harder, everything more dangerous, and any mechanical failure far more consequential. At 0915 hours, the thunderbolts of the 61st Fighter Squadron lifted off from Halesworth in sequence. There are 2,800 engines producing a sound that ground crews described as somewhere between a sustained thunderclap and the roar of a very large and very angry animal. The formation climbed steadily, punching through the high overcast and emerging into the cold brilliance of the upper atmosphere. Brown flew in the position designated Blue 3, the third aircraft in the second flight element. It was a position that placed him on the right side of the formation, responsible for watching the right flank for threats approaching from that quarter. For the first 40 minutes, the mission proceeded normally. The formation crossed the channel without incident. The French coastline appeared below them, the pale lines of beaches giving way to the darker greens and browns of the inland countryside. The B-17s they were escorting were visible as a cluster of shapes 1,000 feet below and slightly ahead, their vapor trails marking clean lines across the cold sky. At approximately 10:45 hours, the Luftwaffe made contact. The initial warning came from the lead flight. Bandits, 3 o'clock high. Then, almost immediately, a second call. Multiple bandits. 10 o'clock, same level. What had appeared to be a routine escort was now a developing engagement. The German aircraft were Focke-Wulf 190s, the WWII-A7 variant, the latest iteration of one of the finest fighter aircraft in the world. Fast, heavily armed with 420mm cannons and to 13mm machine guns, and flown by pilots who, whatever their declining numbers and resources, retained the skills and aggression of a force that had been at war for nearly 5 years. The engagement that followed was violent and chaotic in the way all large-scale aerial combat was violent and chaotic. Aircraft broke in every direction, throttles went to maximum, gun cameras activated, radio traffic devolved into a rapid succession of warnings, acknowledgments, and the clipped, urgent language of men under fire. Brown found himself separated from his flight leader within the first 90 seconds. He had rolled hard right to follow an FW-190 that had made a pass at one of the B-17s, and when he rolled back level, his section had scattered across a 20-mile piece of sky. He kept fighting. Over the next 12 minutes, flying alone or in temporary, improvised company with other P-47s from the 56th, Brown engaged 3 separate FW-190s. 2 he drove off with deflection shots. Angles of fire that forced the German pilots to break away from their attack runs. The 3rd he struck solidly with a sustained burst from his 8.50 caliber M to Browning machine guns, seeing hits register across the enemy aircraft's right-wing route before the FW-190 rolled inverted and disappeared below the cloud layer trailing heavy black smoke. He would later claim it as a probable, not a confirmed kill. That restraint in assessment was characteristic of the man, but during those 12 minutes of intense maneuvering, something had happened to Brown's aircraft that he had not yet fully registered. A burst of 20mm cannon fire from an FW-190 that had come in from his 7 o'clock, slightly behind and to the left, had struck the P-47 in the right side of the engine cowling. The damage was not immediately catastrophic. The R280 was an 18-cylinder, twin-row radial engine of enormous robustness, and it had been specifically designed to continue operating with substantial damage to individual cylinders and their associated systems. But the 20mm round had done more than punch a hole in the cowling. It had severed an oil line, and it had nicked a fuel feed component in a way that would, over the next several minutes, produce consequences that no amount of engineering excellence could fully counteract. At 11:08 hours, Brown noticed the first warning sign. His oil pressure gauge, normally steady at 75 pounds per square inch in cruise configuration, had dropped to 52. He tapped the instrument panel instinctively. a habit of pilots who distrusted their gauges before they distrusted their engines. The needle did not move. By 11:12 hours, oil pressure had fallen to 31 psi. By 11:15 hours, smoke was visible from the engine cowling. And then, at 11:17 hours, exactly 8 minutes after the cannon round had struck his aircraft, the fire started. The fire appeared first as a thin orange line along the right side of the cowling, where the punctured oil line was feeding raw lubricant onto superheated engine components. Within 40 seconds, it had grown into something unmistakable, a steady, visible flame, perhaps 18 inches in length, trailing back along the fuselage and flickering with sickening energy against the slipstream. Brown's immediate response was exactly what his training demanded. He activated the aircraft's CO2 fire suppression system, which discharged directly into the engine compartment. For approximately 6 seconds, the flames diminished. He watched the fire gauge. He watched the cowling. The flames returned. He was now at 21,400 feet, approximately 95 miles from the French coast, flying in a general northwest direction that would theoretically take him toward the channel. Behind him, the engagement was still ongoing. Radio traffic continued to fill his headset with the voices of other pilots. Ahead of him, there was nothing but cold air and the long mathematical problem of whether a burning P-47 could cover 200 miles before either the fire consumed the engine entirely or the engine consumed itself from oil starvation. He ran the numbers instinctively, the way combat pilots do, not formally, not carefully, but with the compressed urgency of a mind under extreme stress performing essential calculations. At his current speed of approximately 280 miles per hour, the coast of France was 15 to 20 minutes away. The English coast, home, safety, a runway, was 35 to 40 minutes beyond that. He was carrying enough fuel. That was not the question. The question was whether the engine would hold together long enough to get him there. He made his first key decision. He would not bail out over France. Not yet. The implications of that decision were clear to every pilot who flew in the European theater. Bailing out over occupied France meant capture, with high probability. The German prisoner of war system for Allied airmen, while varying considerably in its treatment of prisoners, represented, at minimum, years of captivity. At worst, it meant something considerably darker. The Luftwaffe's treatment of downed Allied pilots was generally professional, but the SS, and in some areas the civilian population that had endured years of Allied bombing, were different matters entirely. Brown pushed the nose down slightly, trading altitude for airspeed. He understood that a lower power setting might slow the rate at which the damaged engine was deteriorating. He pulled his throttle back to 42 inches of manifold pressure, reduced from the combat setting of over 60 inches he had been running during the engagement. The engine's note changed. The vibration changed. The fire, measured against the cowling, seemed to stabilize at its current dimensions rather than growing. He was now flying at 240 miles per hour at an altitude of 18,000 feet, descending slowly, pointed northwest. For the next 8 minutes, he flew in a state of controlled suspension, the engine running, the fire burning, neither condition improving nor catastrophically worsening. He checked his oil pressure, 14 psi, critically low. He checked his cylinder head temperature, climbing toward the red line. He checked his fuel state, adequate. He checked the fire, still there, always there. At 11:31 hours, the engine began to run rough, not catastrophically rough, not the seizing, grinding, terminal roughness of an engine that has given up entirely, but the smooth, authoritative pulse of the R280 at cruise power had become something uneven, something intermittent, a hesitation in the power delivery that Brown could feel through the airframe and through the rudder pedals beneath his feet. He was 67 miles from the French coast. He made his second key decision. He would not change his course. He would not divert toward the nearest point of the French coastline and a potential crash landing in what might or might not be a suitable field. He had studied enough maps to know that the territory below him, the rolling farmland of northern France between Amiens and Abbeville, was heavily occupied with German garrison forces, radar installations, and anti-aircraft positions distributed throughout. A crash landing there was survival of an uncertain kind. He kept flying northwest. The engine ran rough at 11:33 hours, rougher at 11:35. At 11:37, it surged a sudden, lurching increase in power output followed by a drop, and Brown had to correct with opposite rudder to keep the wings level. The fire on the cowling had now spread slightly, creeping back toward the wing root with the slow, determined patience of something that has all the time in the world. And then, at 11:39 hours, Brown heard something over his radio that changed his situation in one specific way. A voice, calm, authoritative, from what he would later identify as a fellow 56th Fighter Group pilot named Lieutenant Donald Renner, cut through the radio. Chatter, Blue 3, I have you visual. I'm at your 6, hi. What's your status? Brown was no longer alone. He keyed his radio. His voice, by his own later account, was steadier than he expected. Blue 3, one engine, on fire. Oil pressure critical. Attempting to reach the coast. Renner's response was immediate. Copy, Blue 3, I'm with you. That single transmission, 3 words, carried a weight that anyone who has ever been in genuine danger will understand. In a situation defined by isolation and impossible odds, someone had chosen to stay. Renner had not been ordered to escort a damaged aircraft. He had not been directed by any tactical protocol. He had seen a burning P-47 alone in the sky and made a personal decision to fly alongside it, accepting whatever risk that companionship might bring. Brown reduced power further, now running at 38 inches of manifold pressure. The engine roughness persisted but did not immediately worsen. He was at 15,000 feet. The fire continued. He could see the coast of France appearing as a faint, dark line on the horizon. It was the most beautiful thing he had seen in months, and yet it was still 45 miles away. At 11:48 hours, Second Lieutenant Harold Brown crossed the French coastline north of Boulogne at 12,800 feet, his engine on fire, his oil pressure gauge reading 0. Below him, the English Channel stretched away. To the northwest, gray, cold, and enormous. On a clear day, from altitude, England was visible as a darker mass on the horizon. This was not a clear day. The high overcast had thickened during the past hour, and visibility at lower altitudes had decreased. England was there. He knew it. Was there. He could not see it. He made his third key decision, and arguably the most consequential one of the entire ordeal. He would not descend to crash land in the Channel. He would not ditch. Ditching a P-47 was an exceptionally dangerous undertaking. The aircraft's weight and shape made water landings unpredictable and often fatal. And survival time in the North Sea and English Channel in March was measured in minutes rather than hours. He would keep the engine running at whatever reduced power it could maintain, and he would cross the Channel at altitude, preserving his options. Renner stayed with him at a loose wing position, approximately 200 yards to his left and slightly above. Brown's P-47, tail number 4275614, a machine with 340 combat flying hours on its airframe, was now performing at the very edge of what could be asked of any aircraft. The RT-80 engine was running on virtually no oil. Its internal components were operating at temperatures far beyond design specifications. The fire on the cowling had, in the past few minutes, undergone a strange evolution. It had stopped growing. Brown's reduced power setting had slowed the rate of fuel contamination feeding the flames, and the extraordinary robustness of the engine's basic mechanical structure was allowing it to continue producing power despite conditions that should, by any conventional engineering assessment, have caused complete failure many minutes earlier. He was producing, by his own estimate, approximately 900 to 1,000 horsepower, roughly 40% of the engine's rated output. It was enough to maintain level flight. Just at 11:55 hours, he crossed the midpoint of the Channel. At 12:01 hours, the English coast appeared. He was at 9,400 feet. The engine was shaking now with a sustained, rhythmic vibration that he could feel in his spine and in his jaw teeth. The fire on the cowling had actually diminished slightly. The oil that had been feeding it had largely burned away or leaked out, and what remained was a steadier, lower flame rather than the aggressive orange prominence of 30 minutes earlier. It was a small mercy in a situation that had very few. Renner called the nearest available airfield, Raff Manston, on the northeastern tip of Kent, an airfield specifically designated as an emergency landing ground for damaged aircraft returning from operations over Europe. Its runways were wider and longer than standard, its crash facilities more substantial, its controllers experienced in handling aircraft arriving in states of severe damage. At 12:07 hours, Manston's controller responded and cleared Brown for immediate priority approach. No pattern, no holding, straight in, any runway. Brown began his descent. He reduced power to its minimum viable setting. The engine, asked to do less, responded with something approaching gratitude. The vibration decreased marginally. And for approximately 4 minutes, the burning P-47 descended toward the Kent countryside in a state of violent but manageable controlled flight. At 1,500 feet, the engine seized. It did not explode. It did not disintegrate. The WWII, having performed the extraordinary feat of keeping a fire-damaged aircraft airborne for 52 minutes and a distance of approximately 197 miles, simply stopped. The propeller continued to windmill in the slipstream, still providing some residual aerodynamic effect, but the power was gone. Brown was now flying a very heavy glider. He had 1,500 feet of altitude, a runway 1 mile ahead and slightly to his left, and no engine. He adjusted his approach angle. He lowered his landing gear. The hydraulic system, miraculously, was still functional. He confirmed the gear was down and locked. He adjusted his trim tabs. He held his airspeed at 150 miles per hour, 10 knots above the P-47's minimum approach speed, maintaining his margin against a stall. The runway came up fast, faster than he would have liked. Without an engine to modulate his descent, he crossed the runway threshold at 140 miles per hour. He flared the aircraft. The main gear touched the concrete. The tail wheel came down. The aircraft rolled, straight and true, decelerating rapidly on Manston's long, emergency-rated runway. At 12:11 hours on March 15, 1944. Second Lieutenant Harold Brown brought P-47 Thunderbolt for a 27561 to a complete stop on the runway. At RAF, and he sat in the cockpit for a moment before anyone reached him. Ground crews and emergency vehicles were already converging from multiple directions. The fire on the engine cowling had gone out when the engine seized. Without the heat source and the remaining fuel supply, it had simply died. The cowling itself was scorched black along a 24-inch section. The oil system was completely dry. When maintenance personnel opened the engine cowling, they found bearing surfaces ground to near metal-on-metal contact throughout multiple cylinder heads. The engineering assessment that followed was unambiguous. The engine should not have continued running after approximately minute 8 of the ordeal. That it had continued for 52 minutes, across approximately 197 to 200 miles of English Channel and French airspace, was described in the maintenance report as exceptional, beyond any standard expectation of component performance. Above him, Renner made a single low pass over the runway, the aviator's traditional acknowledgement, before turning back toward Halesworth to land. In the days that followed March 15, 1944, the maintenance crews at Manston completed their full assessment of P-47 Thunderbolt for a 275-614. The damage inventory told the story with the cold precision of technical documentation. The RT-80 engine had sustained a 20 mm cannon penetration through the right side of the forward cowling, severing the primary oil feed line and damaging a fuel distribution component. It had operated for approximately 52 minutes in a state of progressive oil starvation, with internal temperatures well beyond design operating limits throughout that period. At least 4 of the engine's 18 cylinders had suffered bearing seizure damage, with 2 additional cylinders showing severe scoring of the cylinder walls. The fact that the engine had not thrown a connecting rod, an event that would have almost certainly resulted in catastrophic structural failure, fire propagation, and probable loss of the aircraft, was attributed by engineers to both the inherent strength of the R-2800's design and what one maintenance officer's written report referred to, with professional understatement, as favorable circumstances. Second Lieutenant Harold Brown was uninjured. He was evaluated by medical personnel at Manston, given a cup of tea by a British WAAF corporal whose name he would remember for the rest of his life, and returned to RAF Halesworth by ground transport. The following morning, his after-action report was filed on March 16. It was characteristically precise and notably restrained in its language. He described the 20 mm strike, the fire, the oil pressure loss, his decision to maintain course toward England, and the engine seizure at 1,500 feet over Manston, of his own decision-making and endurance through the ordeal. He wrote a single sentence: I assessed that maintaining altitude and proceeding toward home base represented the course of action most likely to result in recovery of the aircraft and its pilot, the 56th Fighter Group's commanding officer, Colonel Hubert Zemke, himself one of the most accomplished fighter leaders of the entire war, commended Brown's action in the group's operational record. The Air Force subsequently awarded 2nd Lieutenant Harold Brown the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on March 15, 1944. The citation recognized not only the flight itself but his earlier engagement with FW-190 aircraft during the escort mission, crediting him with one probable aerial victory. Donald Renner, whose decision to stay with Brown's aircraft across the channel had provided the kind of moral support that cannot be quantified but should never be underestimated, received a formal letter of commendation for his actions. P-47 Thunderbolt for 275614 never flew again. Its engine was removed and shipped to a depot maintenance facility for forensic engineering analysis. The airframe was assessed as repairable but was ultimately not returned to service. Its combat life concluded on that runway. At Manston, the aircraft had given everything it had. The broader context of that day's operations placed Brown's experience within a larger pattern of extraordinary events that was becoming almost routine for the 8th Air Force in early 1944. The campaign was grinding toward its climax. D-Day was less than 3 months away, and the relentless pressure on German air power and industrial infrastructure was producing results, but at a cost measured in aircraft and human lives that was staggering in its scale. In the month of March 1944 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 349 aircraft and over 3,000 airmen killed, wounded, or captured. Against that scale of sacrifice, one lieutenant and one burning P-47 might seem a small thing. History is made of small things. The story of Brown's flight survived in squadron records, in maintenance reports, in the DFC citation, and in the memories of men who flew with him. It became, in the way of such stories within military units, part of the collective understanding of what was possible, what an aircraft could survive, what a pilot could endure, and what a comrade would do when you needed him most. The Republic. P-47 Thunderbolt went on to complete the war as one of the definitive fighter aircraft of the conflict. In its various variants, it flew more than 546,000 combat sorties in the European and Pacific theaters. P-47 pilots were credited with destroying over 12,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. The aircraft's ability to absorb battle damage and bring its pilot home became one of its defining characteristics, a characteristic that Harold Brown had explored to its absolute limit on a cold March afternoon over the Channel. The R-280 Wasp engine, for its part, became one of the most celebrated power plants in aviation history, a machine whose combination of power, reliability, and durability set standards that influenced engine design for a generation. But engines and airframes are ultimately instruments. What matters in history, what actually drives events and determines outcomes, is what the people inside those machines decide to do when everything is on fire and the odds are telling them to quit. Harold Brown decided not to quit. That decision, made at 21,000 feet over occupied France with an oil pressure gauge reading 0 and fire on his cowling, was not made out of recklessness. It was not made out of ignorance of the danger. It was made with full awareness of the situation and a deliberate, rational assessment that going home was the right thing to do. That calm, in the face of what he was facing, may be the most remarkable part of the entire story. The skies of occupied Europe were full of stories like this one, and also unlike this one, because every aircraft that went down, every pilot who made it home or didn't, every decision made at altitude in cold air and mortal danger was its own irreducible human experience. Some of those experiences were recorded, many were not. The men who lived them often didn't speak of them afterward, or spoke of them only in fragments, in the company of others who had been there and didn't need the details explained. What we owe them, perhaps, is exactly this, the attempt to reconstruct those moments with the seriousness and the care they deserve. To remember that behind every aircraft designation and every casualty number and every medal citation, there was a person, a 22-year-old from Indiana, a pilot who looked at a burning engine and decided to fly home. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.